Welcome to Integrity Talks, where we explore ethical leadership, responsible business, and sustainability. Joining us in this episode of Integrity Talks podcast is Aurex Constructors, a powerhouse in South African construction, turnaround, and maintenance sector. With over 4 decades of expertise, Aurex has built a strong track record delivering high-impact solutions across oil and gas, mining, infrastructure, and power industries. Operating across South Africa, Mozambique, and Namibia, Aurex is 100% South African-owned and 51% Black-owned, a testament to their commitment to transformation and inclusive growth. Known for their skilled workforce and innovative project delivery, Aurex continues to shape the future of sustainable, ethical business in the region. We're honored to have them join the conversation on strengthening ethics and compliance across supply chains.
Welcome to the Integrity Talks, where we zero in on ethics in action and really understand how ethics in action strengthen businesses' role beyond compliance. Today, I'm joined by Rohini Pillay, a seasoned professional in legal matters. She's not only focusing on legal compliance, but also on governance. Rohini, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I am very passionate about ethics in business and also ethical leadership. I am currently the Legal Governance and Compliance Manager at Aurex Constructors, and we specialize in the energy and construction sector.
Interesting industries. So we're going to have a seriously exciting conversation here. Rohini, maybe give us a bit of insight. What does a legal expert look at when you're talking about governance and compliance? What does that mean, and more especially in your industry?
So it's a very broad spectrum of topics that you deal with, because you're looking at your corporate governance levels from stakeholder management to your board level, and then that filters into your actual implementation of your strategies amongst your executives, and then hopefully that filters down within your workplace. So from a legal compliance point of view, we're looking at reviewing your contracts, your risk management, and basically the overall landscape of your contractual obligations. And then that steers its way into your governance portfolio, which is looking more along the lines of ethical business practices, integrity, etc.
So we can safely say that legal matters and ethical practices go hand in hand.
Absolutely.
And business really then can't function or operate outside of this.
Yes.
So I'm glad that we're having this conversation with you so we can really have a balanced understanding of why ethics is important and how it borrows or balances out with legal requirements. So Rohini, we're talking about ethics here and how we're really balancing governance and legal compliance. Why is ethics actually important for business?
So it is a foundational principle for all business models in South Africa, especially in our sector, which is construction and engineering, where you find things like health and safety, quality and reliability are at its paramount. So when you have an ethical foundation, for example, in Aurex Constructors, integrity is a core value. And it's not just a principle that we throw out there. It's something that we would like our employees to live and breathe. So when it becomes a living, breathing entity, it actually can filter through more naturally within your business. And that will create more tender competitiveness. It can also help you to attract business partners that are more aligned to your values. And that makes it a lot more easier when it becomes second nature, because then you have a workforce that is basically self-regulating. And then you also have it feed into your supply chain.
So it talks to an organization's strategic position and advantage in terms of how it positions itself and participates in the market space. And I think it's an important point for SMEs to take note of and understand that it's really not just a tick box exercise, but it is a capability tool, an empowerment tool. Let's touch, maybe delve a bit deeper in terms of ethics and the role it plays in business. So now we looked at the larger scope of why it's important for business in general to adhere to or live up to ethical practices. How would this feature for an SME, especially in your industry, where I can imagine you have a very complex space of supply chain with multiple service providers and SMEs at different levels with different capacity. How does ethics feature for you guys and your SMEs?
So for us as a business, we have a zero tolerance policy when it comes to corruption and bribery and anything that is unethical in nature. So, for example, if we are onboarding a supplier or we're onboarding a vendor, we have a supplier code of conduct that we require everybody that does business with us to sign. And that really sets out the landscape and the requirement of what we expect from you when you contract with us. And it helps them to get an understanding of why we would choose them to work with. It's important for SMMEs to also understand that, especially in the landscape of South Africa as it currently is, regulatory compliance is becoming a little bit more strict. We would know that South Africa has recently been grey listed, for instance.
Yeah.
So that obviously steps up the FICA requirements of know your customer processes. It's becoming more stricter. In the public space with procurement, we got the PFMA that is basically shining a light on how we procure things,
Correct.
misusing of funds. So the advice to SMMEs is ultimately, whether you're operating in the public or the private space, if you have a strong governance, principled business, it makes you more competitive within your market, and it will help you to grow your business to where you want it to be.
And we definitely want that. We want small businesses that are going to grow stronger, that are going to participate more productively within the market and contribute, because the role of ethics is really not just an onus on corporate business or government, but it also falls as onus on the SME as well as the individual leaders themselves. So you mentioned, for example, a supplier code of conduct, and that outlines specific requirements for the SME to comply with and adhere to. So what would be some of the misconceptions or challenges that SMEs face with actually upholding those compliance requirements?
So if you are an SMME and you're applying for tenders, it's best to stick to what you know, your core services. And after a period of time of consistent delivery, you will be able to build reliability as your reputation. And then later on, if you want to expand your service offering, then do so. But at this point, sticking to what you know and doing it well is probably going to serve you better in the long run. So with regard to additional challenges that we might face, is also community engagement. It's very important that when you're operating in a new area, that you approach communities sensitively, because you're also trying to empower local businesses there. You're also trying to improve on the employment rate in that particular community. And you have to be able to do that in a way that is sort of non-politicized. So those are the challenges that we face. But in terms of trying to bridge that gap of what an SMME might face, for instance, if we are sending out a request for quotation to various suppliers, it's important for us to actually have a clear outline of what the criteria is, of how you will be evaluated, that we are following a fair and transparent process. And it's very key that even after you've awarded that tender, to close that feedback loop, right? To go back to the unsuccessful bidders and explain to them, these were your shortfalls, these were the gaps that we've identified, this is the areas that you can improve on. And that's not only self-serving to our business, but it's serving them, it's empowering them, that when they are applying for other opportunities with other corporations, that they can actually stand a chance of winning more work.
And I absolutely agree with that, Rohini. What we found through the Ethical Supplier Project, where we had an opportunity to engage with SMEs to really understand how are they navigating the landscape and what are those challenges, and that definitely came through, right? Access to information, clearly understanding what the requirements are. So when you're talking to outlining those simply and clearly, really is an important element, plays out as an important element. But also that feedback, it really is important, because we want our SMEs to improve. We want them to gain the necessary skill and knowledge. So I think that really is an important aspect that Aurex is playing out and providing feedback that really is critical to the SME. I think the other thing from what you're saying that stands out for me is that definitely business does not operate in isolation. And we want to highlight that business functions in a collaborative and shared society, and it can't function in a broken society. So for us to drive sustainable practices and drive and realize even some of the sustainable goals, we need the different stakeholders to come up and play their part. And what would you say would then be the important role that corporate can play in really bridging that gap and assisting SMEs? You can even touch on what SMEs can also do, because we are clear that it's a responsibility for everybody concerned.
So I think for corporates, moving away from this tick box exercise is absolutely key. And you have to move more towards a shared value approach. And with that being said, for example, at our company, we have an integrity department, which I lead. And from that, it feeds into our sub-board committee, which is a social and ethics committee. And basically, that keeps a pulse check within the business around ethical business practices, et cetera, et cetera. From that point, we've also identified specific portfolios that we've implemented within our business, such as having a supplier relationship manager whose role is specific to being the first point of contact for any of our suppliers. That helps them to understand what our requirements are. It sets the tone for what they need clarification on. And it really helps them to sort of understand what is required and what is expected. Second to that, we also have a dedicated supplier development portfolio. So we will have certain SMMEs that we assist them in getting them market ready so that they can actually go out into the world and look for opportunities to grow their business. So if more corporations actually have a structured program where they are collaborating through mutual growth with SMMEs, it can really do wonders for the economy and for the entire political and South African landscape that we live in.
And I think that's an important thing, collaboration, right, through that mutual engagement, because it definitely can't be a one-sided exercise for either the SME or the corporate industry. So, Rohini, the construction and engineering industry is a challenging one. It's definitely not an easy one to operate in. And I believe the requirements are also quite stringent. So what are some of the guidelines or frameworks that are available that SMEs could possibly align themselves with to, one, better function in that space and understand what requirements actually are in place for them to adhere to?
So for SMMEs in particular, it shouldn't be complicated. They need to start off simple, because the most important thing at that stage is to have clear documentation, to make sure your invoices are done correctly, having fair labor practices, because that creates traceability. Once you're ready to progress in terms of your business expansion in the direction that it's going in, if you are currently part of a supplier development program, then lean on your big corporates. Ask them for help. Ask them to show you how to actually implement a governance structure. It does not need to be complex. It can be as simple as just having traceable documents. Once you get to a point where your business is sort of medium to large, then you can start referring to guidelines such as the King 4 principles. And the main principles of King 4 is ultimately fairness, accountability, reliability, and transparency. So in the South African context, what that means is that corporations have to make a commitment towards transformation and responsible procurement. And together, that will really build a more sustainable and mutual collaboration between SMMEs and big corporates.
And I think that's definitely an important relationship to be mindful of. We've got, in addition to the King 4, is that it does align with sustainable development goals. And it aligns to commitments at national development plan levels, that we want a society, we want a workplace and a working environment that is safe, that is built on mutual respect, that really does drive transformation at different levels, but also inclusion. And I think your industry really focuses on that. You touched on some of the challenges that you access service providers that are in rural areas, that are in or peri-urban areas. And that means their level of expertise might not be as advanced, or the level of knowledge that is required might not be at the same standard as cities, for example. So how do you navigate some of those challenges when you transition from high-skilled zoned areas to rural areas where we want participation, we want inclusion, we want diversity, we want youth to participate, we want women to participate in business opportunities, we want the broad spectrum of society to really also benefit. What are maybe some of the challenges that you face, especially in the industry when you go to rural areas, and how do you address that to bring in more SMEs into your supply chain?
So I think it's important to say that you have to move away from a transactional relationship with SMMEs. The only way that it would work is if you're actually invested in creating a long-term partner. Some of the things that we've experienced in the industry is that the only way to kind of uplift and empower the local SMMEs is by having an open dialogue, by trying to support them in improving some of their systems or getting them market ready. And that is basically what our supplier development program aims at doing. And that kind of bridges the gap a bit. It would be obviously far more beneficial if more corporations start getting involved in similar structured kind of programs, because then it means that we can change the economy together. And you then move away from trying to police SMMEs or small suppliers, and instead of doing that, of being a police officer, you're actually building a mutual respect relationship.
Yeah. And if you talk on building mutual respect, is how could an SME align its strategy to really, one, adhere and support ethical practices, but also just show up as a equal, not so equal, but in terms of a participating stakeholder in this ethical supply chain? How could they adjust their strategies to really talk to the opportunities that are available and the requirements that a corporate like yourselves would have?
So I think in the space of SMMEs, like I mentioned before, if you're sticking to your core services, the most important thing is to deliver those core services to the best of your ability, because that ultimately builds your reputation within your industry and amongst your clients. It's also, if you are basically applying for a tender and you have a BEE certificate that's specific to an industry code, stick to opportunities that are within that industry code. Avoid the disappointment of overextending and applying for something that is actually out of your scope and being disqualified from the start. So if you focus on those small areas, you basically already aligning yourself to what the requirements are of big corporates, if you want to call it that.
I'd also imagine that focusing on a specific area would help manage the compliance and monetary requirements that are linked to that, where you don't have multiple standards to adhere to, where you don't have multiple frameworks to adhere to. So when you are specializing and focusing on that, it helps you really be a bit more proactive and better manage your resources and ability to participate and contribute. So, Rohini, let's talk about the role and importance of integrity, transparency, and accountability. Big words, but what do they actually mean, and how does that play out in your space?
So they both actually factor into having mutual growth and respect. So with transparency, it creates that open dialogue. It moves away from that transactional approach like we spoke about. And with accountability, it's important for each party to take responsibility for their actions. Responsibility is also one of our core values at our business. So we also take that to heart because it helps you to build a partnership. Again, sort of minimizing the unscaled balances or uneven balances between the two parties. Because that way you allow SMMEs to grow, to innovate, and to actually spread their wings in the correct way.
And what are some of the initiatives or programs that Aurex has actually driven or is currently driving that focus on upholding accountability for all stakeholders involved, but also driving that transparency and integrity?
So ultimately, we have a zero tolerance policy on unethical behavior. So we've run a campaign called the Speak Up campaign, which is basically published in all the official languages of South Africa. And that is published on all of our project sites and within our offices as well. It's also available on our website. Ultimately, that allows not only your internal stakeholders, but external as well, that if they observe something that is untoward or perhaps potentially corrupt, they can report it anonymously on the hotline. That gets fed back into our integrity department. And then we can launch a full-scale internal investigation if required, and then put in remedial actions or corrective measures. And what that really does is it resonates a lot with our entire supply chain, because then we all know that we are on the same page when it comes to ethical compliance.
So, Rohini, I think that's really important that not just your stakeholders, but also your SMEs or supply chain participants know that Aurex has the Speak Up platform, because then that goes into building trust between all stakeholders, and more so between business and society, where there's confidence that if there is a problem, we can boldly bring that forward, it'll be addressed, and we can start working collectively towards sorting out those problems. So aiming for an ethical supply chain and an ethical business environment means that we will be building a sustainable work environment as well. And that talks to shared value between businesses, suppliers, and society. Let's double click on that. What is the importance of really driving that shared value and talking to how ethics play out in the long term, and where we might not have immediate gains, but how do they really play out in the long term?
So if you have active participation between your regulators, your SMMEs, your corporates, and your local communities, that can help to strengthen the overall relationship and strategic partnerships that you want to create, because that will be underpinned by governance, trust, and mutual respect. And together, we can reshape the economy through transformation, through innovation, and actually bring this culture into a second nature.
And I think that's so critical, that ethics becomes part of our culture. It becomes second nature at all levels, that it really isn't a one-sided exercise. And we practice and live that out every day, from SME leaders, from SME participants, but corporates as well as our government stakeholders as well. So, Rohini, what advice or guidance would you have for our audiences? And that includes corporate, government, but more specifically our SMEs.
So we have unwritten ground rules at Aurex. And one of them, when it comes to integrity, is do the right thing always. So when you do the right thing always, together we can have a more sustainable value creation.
So it's clear that we can construct an ethical society together, with contributions and commitment from both private and public sector, as well as yourself as the SME and leader. We really can create the kind of future and the kind of environment that's not only beneficial to one, but it's mutually beneficial to all. And more so, it's a sustainable society and a sustainable environment. So let's do the right thing and live out our ethics in action.
Thank you for joining Integrity Talks. Stay tuned as we continue to champion ethical leadership, responsible business, and sustainability. Visit nbi/integritytalks.org.za to explore, gain insights, and be part of the conversation.